Imagine standing on a completely pristine, pitch black sand beach.
Oh, wow. Yeah, just picture that.
You look up, and there is a 4,500-foot mountain just towering directly over you.
Like a jagged green wall.
Exactly. It is actually one of the youngest mountain ranges on the entire Pacific coast. So you look at the mountain, and then you walk to the water's edge and look down into the surf.
And that is where it gets really crazy.
It does, because hidden just beneath those waves, the ocean floor suddenly plunges nearly 7,000 feet.
It's a massive drop.
Right into a pitch-black underwater chasm called Delgada Canyon. And somewhere in the cliffs right behind you, according to local legend anyway, is a cave completely sealed shut by a 19th century earthquake.
Supposedly hiding a lost pirate-era Russian treasure.
Exactly. Welcome to the Lost Coast.
I love that introduction because it really highlights the extremes of this place. I mean, it is the absolute definition of a geographical anomaly.
Yeah.
When you look at a map of California, human engineering has pretty much conquered the entire coastline. We have blasted tunnels, we poured concrete, we built Highway 1 to hug the cliffs all the way up from San Diego.
Right. It's like a ribbon of pavement the whole way.
But when you hit the border of Mendocino and Humboldt counties, the map just breaks.
It literally gives up.
Yeah, for a stretch of about 50 miles, the highway literally gives up and turns inland.
It is basically a giant do not disturb sign made of solid rock.
That is exactly what it is.
And the topography of this area, specifically a hidden sanctuary tucked away right in the middle of it called Shelter Cove, acts like a natural fortress wall. I mean, the highway builders took one look at that vertical drop and said, well, yeah, absolutely not.
We will just go around, thanks.
Right. And that is exactly what we are exploring in this deep dive. We're taking you to Shelter Cove to see how this dramatic, physically imposing geography hasn't just shaped the landscape.
It has entirely dictated the identity of the people who tried to live there.
Over centuries, yeah. Because the geography here just does not compromise.
No, not at all. And to understand why it's so extreme, you have to look at the geological violence that actually created it.
Okay, lay it on us.
So this was not a gentle, millions of years long sloping formation. At some point in an early geological era, there was a massive cataclysmic tectonic upheaval.
Like a huge earthquake.
More like the Earth's crust essentially shattered. And it thrusts the land upward and outward into the Pacific Ocean.
Oh, wow.
And that violent push created the cove itself. It left behind this massive alluvial fan.
Which is for those of us who aren't geologists.
Oh, right. It is essentially a wide, fan-shaped expanse of incredibly rich black loam soil. And it spreads out from the base of the mountains all the way down toward those black sand beaches.
Right, and because of that violent thrust outward, it created this very rare, shallow draft refuge in what is otherwise a totally brutal stretch of water.
Which is exactly what caught the attention of the earliest European explorers.
Yeah, if you go all the way back to the 1500s, you had these Spanish galleons returning from China.
Heavily laden with cargo, right?
Yep, riding the Japan Current down the coast of Oregon and California.
And if you have ever experienced the northwesterly weather on that coast, you know it is incredibly unforgiving. I mean, gale force winds, massive swells.
Those galleons were desperate for a safe harbor, and Shelter Cove's unique protrusion offered this rare break in the turbulent ocean.
By the 1600s, the Spanish explorer Vizcaíno actually sailed up this exact coast and named the specific strip of land jutting out from the cove.
What did he call it?
He called it Punta Delgada, which translates directly to thin edge.
Thin edge. That is so poetic, but also, terrifyingly accurate when you consider that underwater canyon dropping off just offshore.
Yeah, the thin edge between a safe beach and a 7,000-foot drop.
Exactly. But you know what fascinates me most about this early exploration era? It's the Russian connection. You mentioned the earthquake-sealed cave earlier. What is the actual historical grounding for that?
Well, we know the Russians had outposts further south, like Fort Ross, primarily for hunting sea otters.
Right, the Russian-American company.
Exactly. They were highly active along the California coast in the early 1800s, and sea otter pelts were incredibly valuable.
And Shelter Cove's tide pools would have supported a massive otter population.
Huge. But officially, there is no formal record of a permanent Russian settlement at Shelter Cove itself.
But the locals say otherwise.
Oh, absolutely. Local lore, which has been passed down through generations of residents, insists that a Russian ship ran aground right below King's Peak.
And according to the legend, the survivors managed to salvage a massive haul of treasure from the wreck.
But then they clashed with the local indigenous people and were killed.
And the treasure was supposedly buried deep inside a cave at the base of the mountain. And then, as if the landscape itself was trying to swallow the evidence, a localized earthquake triggered a landslide.
Completely sealing the entrance shaft.
It sounds like pure Hollywood fiction.
It does. But you have to remember the tectonic instability of that specific area. Massive landslides are not just possible there, they're frequent.
So it could happen.
Definitely could. Even today, people still occasionally show up at the Cove with metal detectors and surveying gear, hoping to find the lost Kings Peak treasure.
That is wild. But whether there's gold in those cliffs or not, the true wealth of Shelter Cove wasn't buried in a cave.
No, it was right out in the open, in the water.
Which brings us to this really fascinating observation from 1860. So there's this government surveyor named Lewis. He is exploring the coast on foot, just fighting his way through the brush and the heavy fog.
A miserable trek, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely brutal. But he finally stumbles out onto the black loam soil of the cove. He looks around at the protected water and formally notes in his records that it is a, quote, weird place, well calculated for a seaside resort.
Which is such a funny observation for 1860. But Lewis was entirely correct in his assessment. The irony is he was about 600 years late.
Right. Thousands of years before any Spanish galleon, before Russian otter hunters, and before Lewis the Surveyor, the Sinkyuan Indians had already figured out that this was the ultimate sanctuary.
For them, Shelter Cove wasn't a forbidding, isolated fortress. It was a bountiful summer paradise.
And to really grasp what life was like for the Sinkyuan here, you have to look at the tide pools.
Yeah, because of the rocky outcroppings and the constant churning of the nutrient-rich Pacific, those tide pools were, and honestly still are, extraordinarily rich ecosystems.
The historical and archaeological records describe an absolute overabundance of sea life.
We are talking dense colonies of sea anemones, mussels, massive abalone, clams, chitons, limpets.
Plus the fish, right? Lingcod, cabezone, sea trout, even octopus in the deeper crevices.
It was essentially a prehistoric all-you-can-eat seafood buffet.
And what really strikes me about this is the sheer ease of life it provided. When we think of indigenous survival, we often picture this constant, grueling struggle against the element.
Right, like barely scraping by.
Yeah, but for the Sinkyuan at Shelter Cove during the summer, their hunting strategy was essentially, well, wait for the tide to go out.
That was it. Walk down to the rocks and pick up dinner.
It is a profound contrast when you compare it to other indigenous cultures of the Americas, particularly agricultural societies.
Oh, totally. Take the Aztecs or the Maya, for example. Their existence required intense, back-breaking, highly organized labor.
Building terraces, clearing jungles.
Exactly. They had to engineer irrigation systems, plant, tend, and harvest crops just to stave off starvation. But the Sinkyuan at Shelter Cove didn't have to farm.
Because the ocean freely delivered an overabundance of high-density protein and vital nutrients to their doorstep twice a day.
And the archaeological evidence backing this up is just incredible.
Yeah, the University of California sent teams out to excavate the area, right?
They did. And they found massive shell mounds built up over centuries of harvesting.
But the detail that really stuck with me from the sources was the tools. They found these smooth rocks with natural gouges worn into them that perfectly fit a human hand.
Oh, the hand-gouged rocks.
Yeah. The Sinkyuan used them specifically for breaking open shells and extracting the meat.
You could just picture it, sitting on the edge of the bluff, feeling the ocean breeze, cracking open fresh clams and abalone.
It sounds idyllic, but it was a place of immense leisure and sustenance. But it was not without its hidden, lethal dangers.
Nature always has a catch. And the archaeology reveals that too. During those same excavations, researchers unearthed 3 human skeletons dating back to the 1400s.
An adult and 2 children, I believe.
Yes. And what was particularly striking to the anthropologists was that they were found buried in a distinct, tight, crouched position.
Neat. Why crouch? Is that like a cultural burial practice for the Sinkyuan, or does it point to something else?
Well, the working theory points to something much darker, and it's directly related to their food source.
Yeah, the shellfish.
Right. While those mussels and clams were plentiful during the warmer summer months, the coastal waters can experience massive blooms of toxic algae.
What we commonly call red tides.
Exactly. Filter feeders like mussels consume this algae and concentrate the toxins, specifically saxitoxin, in their tissues.
And if a human eats those contaminated mussels,
It causes paralytic shellfish poisoning.
which is incredibly fast-acting and absolutely agonizing.
Precisely. It attacks the nervous system, it causes severe muscle cramping, paralysis, and often respiratory failure.
Oh, wow.
So the theory is that this adult and two children consumed a batch of highly toxic shellfish, suffered excruciating abdominal cramping.
Which would naturally pull the body into a tight fetal or crouched position in agony.
Exactly. And they died suddenly before anyone could help them.
That is horrifying. A stark reminder that even in paradise, nature holds the ultimate trump card.
It does. And nature wasn't the only threat either.
Right. Halfway down one of the cliffs, the archaeologists found another human hip bone. And resting directly against the bone, embedded where flesh would have been, was a stone spearhead.
Which is a clear, undeniable indicator of violent conflict.
So while Shelter Cove was a sanctuary of abundance, it wasn't some utopia immune to the realities of human violence or the sudden, invisible traps set by the environment.
And it wasn't a year-round paradise either.
Yeah, I want to talk about their commute. Because as beautiful as the Cove is in July, I cannot imagine wanting to be trapped on that exposed bluff in January.
Well, you wouldn't survive it. The geography that makes it a perfect summer haven turns it into a wind tunnel of misery in the winter.
The sources said the Lost Coast regularly sees 100 inches of rain during the winter season.
With 60-mile-per-hour gales whipping directly off the freezing Pacific, driving rain horizontally.
So what did they do?
Well, the Sinkyuan understood the limits of the landscape. As the seasons turned, they would pack up their summer camps and trek over the steep mountain passes.
To establish permanent, sheltered winter camps inland.
Deep in the redwood forests and river valleys, yeah.
I love the analogy of thinking about them as the original snowbirds.
It really is a perfect comparison.
You know, like a modern family packing up the station wagon to escape the miserable, hot, insect-filled inland summer to go rent a beach house.
The Sinkyuan were doing the exact same thing hundreds of years ago, just on foot.
But they weren't just going for a vacation. This was a major economic hub for them.
Right, the trade. The shell mounds also contained large amounts of obsidian.
But here is the catch. Obsidian, which is volcanic glass used for making incredibly sharp arrowheads and cutting tools, does not occur naturally anywhere near the sedimentary geology of Shelter Cove.
Which means it had to be imported. Inland tribes from places as far away as Lake County, where there's abundant volcanic activity, were making the grueling trek over the King Range to the coast.
They brought obsidian to trade, and what were they trading for? The one essential commodity the Sinkyuan had in endless supply.
Pure sea salt.
Okay, I really need you to explain this to me because the salt harvesting process mentioned in the research sounds brilliantly simple, but I am trying to picture the mechanics. I mean, I have been to the beach. When a wave splashes on a rock and dries, it leaves a little white film. It doesn't leave a pile of table salt. How are they getting enough volume of salt to actually trade for highly valuable obsidian or entire deer skins?
It comes down to identifying the perfect microgeography within the tide zones.
Okay.
The Sinkyuan weren't just looking at random rocks. They specifically sought out the superlittoral zone.
Oh, yes.
The splash zone high above the normal high tide line. In this zone, there are massive boulders with deep natural depressions or bowls carved into them by millennia of erosion.
Ah, okay.
During massive winter storms, these bowls fill to the brim with highly concentrated seawater.
So it is not just a splash, it is basically a natural wading pool of ocean water.
Exactly. Then the storms pass, the ocean recedes, and the brutal, baking summer sun beats down on those rocks for months.
And it just sits there.
Yep. The water in those deep depressions slowly evaporates, creating an increasingly dense brine until all the moisture is gone.
And what is left?
What remains in the bowl isn't just a film. It is a thick, heavy crust of pure, coarse sea salt, sometimes inches thick.
Oh, wow.
The Sinkyuan would go from rock to rock, scraping out these natural evaporation pans, filling large woven baskets with heavy, valuable salt.
That is phenomenal. They didn't have to build evaporation ponds. They just memorized exactly which rocks on a 50-mile coastline held the deepest bowls.
It represents this profound, intimate harmony with the environment.
They understood the lunar cycles of the tides, the chemistry of evaporation, and the exact physical layout of the geology.
They really did.
If you think about it, if you have ever driven for hours through a sweltering inland summer valley and you finally crest a mountain and feel that profound physical relief of a cool, salty ocean breeze hitting your face.
Best feeling in the world.
Right. You share a very real sensory connection with the people who walked those exact same trails centuries ago.
It is a powerful continuity of human experience. But as we transition into the next era of Shelter Cove's history, that thousands of years old sustainable harmony is completely and violently shattered.
Yeah, and what is most striking in the historical record is how rapidly the paradigm shifted.
The oral history from this period is honestly chilling.
The sources mention a local Sinkyuan man known in the pioneer texts as Indian Jim.
Right. He carried the tribal memories of this first contact. He talked about the stories his elders told of seeing the first boats with sails drifting past the cove.
And then, mere decades later, the sheer, visceral terror of hiding in a dense thicket known as the Willows.
Watching the big boats with the white smoke, the industrial steamships arriving on their shores.
The arrival of those steamships signaled the arrival of early white settlers. And with them came an entirely alien concept of land use.
Right, because for the Sinkyuan, the land and the ocean were a communal, sacred source of sustenance. You take only what you need, you respect the seasons, and you live within the boundaries nature sets.
But when the pioneers arrived, the land instantly became a commodity.
It went from being a shared habitat to a resource to be fenced, owned, and extracted.
And strictly looking at the historical accounts provided in our sources, that clash of worldviews led to an absolute tragedy.
It did. The texts detail that in the 1880s, these early pioneers began bringing herds of cattle over the mountains into the area.
And you can see why, right? The coastal grasses on the bluffs above the cove provided excellent year-round pasture.
Sure, but in this rugged, unfenced, deeply wild terrain, it was inevitable that a few cattle would wander off, fall down a cliff, or go missing.
And when those cattle went missing, the historical records state that the white settlers immediately blamed the Sinkyuan.
They didn't consider predators or the treacherous terrain. They just assumed theft.
The account from the era states that a group of angry white men formed a vigilante posse, sailed up the coast from Fort Bragg, and utilized the dense coastal fog to sneak down the hillsides surrounding the cove.
And they supposedly trapped the Sinkyuan at their traditional camp in the Willows.
Right on the edge of the cliff.
And annihilated them.
It is an incredibly dark chapter, and it effectively ended the Sinkyuan era at Shelter Cove.
It really did.
One of the lingering mysteries of this event, which the sources note, is that later generations searched the area around the Willows extensively, but no human bones were ever found at the site of the alleged massacre.
Whether the ocean claimed them, or the accounts were exaggerated, or the remains were moved, we really don't know.
But the cultural erasure was absolute.
And the speed of that erasure really underscores the brutal efficiency of the pioneer era. Once the indigenous population was removed, the extraction mentality took hold instantly.
Early white settlers, families whose names still dot the local maps like the Yates, the Rays, the Dyes, and eventually the Notley brothers, began aggressively claiming and dividing up the land.
There is one specific detail in the archives that perfectly captures this new, highly transactional nature of the land.
Oh, about John Ray.
Yes. So a pioneer named John Ray wanted the property encompassing the cove. He didn't petition a king. He didn't fight a war. In the 1850s, he literally traded a span of oxen to a man named Hamilton to acquire the entire Shelter Cove ranch.
2 draft animals in exchange for miles of pristine oceanfront paradise.
It perfectly encapsulates the pioneer valuation of the land. It was only worth what it could produce.
And with ownership firmly established, Shelter Cove transitioned almost overnight from an isolated, quiet sanctuary into a booming, deafening Victorian-era industrial hub.
The Boomtown era.
This is where the sheer hubris of human engineering against the Pacific Ocean reaches a fever pitch.
It is wild. In 1885, 2 brothers, the Robarts, who originally came over from England, decided that to truly extract wealth from this land, they needed a deepwater port.
To load giant commercial steamships.
Right, but the problem,
Yeah.
Shelter Cove is shallow and treacherous.
So their solution is to build a massive 960-foot wooden wharf straight out into the violent surf.
Which, if you know anything about the hydrodynamics of this specific coastline, is an act of sheer, staggering audacity.
The winter swells here can easily reach 20 to 30 feet.
Exactly. Building a rigid wooden structure almost 1,000 feet into that kind of kinetic energy is essentially declaring war on the ocean.
And the ocean immediately fought back not just with waves, but with biology.
This part is fascinating.
Yeah, the Robart brothers originally used local fir trees for the massive pilings to hold the pier up. But this is the 1880s. They didn't treat the wood with heavy creosote or protective oils.
That was a fatal engineering flaw. The Pacific Ocean is teeming with marine wood borers, specifically shipworms, which are actually a type of saltwater clam called teredo worms.
Wait, a clam that eats wood?
Yes, they bore into submerged, untreated timber and absolutely feast on the cellulose. They essentially turn those massive fur pilings into hollow, fragile sponges.
So the pier was quite literally being eaten alive from the bottom up.
It was. But you have to hand it to pioneer ingenuity, or maybe stubbornness. Instead of abandoning the million-dollar project, they pivoted.
They realized that they needed a wood that could naturally repel these parasites.
And they discovered that eucalyptus wood is incredibly dense and contains natural oils that make it highly resistant to saltwater rot and marine borers.
So they didn't just order eucalyptus logs. They brought in live eucalyptus trees, planted them right there in the black soil of the Cove, and started cultivating their own supply of rot-resistant pilings.
It was a massive agricultural undertaking just to support an engineering undertaking.
And what's wild is that while only a few of those eucalyptus pilings were actually harvested and driven into the seabed before the pier eventually failed, the descendants of those original eucalyptus trees are still standing today.
Wow, really?
Yeah. If you visit Shelter Cove today, you can see these massive, non-native eucalyptus groves thriving in the fog. A literal living monument to that Victorian industrial ambition.
That is amazing. But while the pier was constantly under repair and construction, the commerce couldn't stop.
Because the water around the pier was still too treacherous for the massive coastal steamships, ships like the Pelican and the Mary Hume, they had to anchor further out in the deep, turbulent water.
Which required an entirely separate fleet of intermediary vessels to move cargo from the beach to the ships.
Enter George Morgan.
This guy was constructing massive 15-ton wooden lighters right there on the beach.
I had to look up what a lighter was. It's basically a heavy-duty, flat-bottomed barge.
Right. They would load these 15-ton beasts with freight and passengers on the sand, and then row or haul them through the breaking surf out to the steamships.
The physical labor required to move a fully loaded 15-ton barge through a Pacific surf zone is almost unimaginable today.
And the volume of freight they were moving was staggering. Inbound, they were supplying the entire isolated inland region.
Hundreds of barrels of flour, tons of sugar, canned goods, hardware, and massive quantities of whiskey.
Of course, whiskey. But the real economic engine, the export that justified all this insane labor and infrastructure, was tan bark.
The tan bark era. I have to admit, before looking at these sources, I had no idea how massive this industry was or what it even entailed.
Oh, it was huge. So you have this guy named Ed Wagner. His family owned the massive Wagner Leather Company down in Stockton, California.
Okay.
They surveyed the steep, rugged mountains inland from Shelter Cove and realized the forests were absolutely choked with California tan oak trees.
To understand why a family from Stockton would care about oak trees on the Lost Coast, you really have to look at the broader context of the 19th century Industrial Revolution.
Because leather was basically the plastic of its day.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
Right. It was the fundamental material that made industry possible. I mean, every single massive machine in every factory across America was driven by heavy leather belts.
Oh, and all horses, right?
Exactly. The millions of horses driving transportation and agriculture, they all required leather harnesses. A rapidly expanding nation needed millions of leather boots.
And you cannot make leather without tannin.
Yeah.
If you just take a raw animal hide, it will just rot.
The bark of the tan oak tree contains extremely high concentrations of tannin, which is the crucial chemical astringent needed to cure and preserve the rawhides, transforming them into durable leather.
The Wagners realized it was completely inefficient to chop down entire oak trees, load them onto steamships, and sail them to Stockton just to peel the bark off.
The shipping costs would ruin them. So they decided to extract the tannin locally.
They built a massive industrial facility called the Pacific Oak Extract Works.
In a tiny inland mountain town called Bryceland, just over the ridge from Shelter Cove.
And the extraction process they used at Bryceland is fascinating. The sources describe it, and it is exactly like brewing the picture's most massive industrial cup of coffee.
It is the perfect analogy. The chemical extraction process relies on percolation. Teams of men would venture into the steep forests, chop down the tan oaks, and manually peel the bark off the trunks.
Backbreaking work.
Oh, totally. They would let the bark age and dry out, and then haul it to the factory in Bryceland. There, massive steam-powered grinders would pulverize the tough bark into a coarse powder.
Essentially creating coffee grounds.
Exactly. Then they would dump tons of this ground bark into massive wooden vats and continuously pump hot water over it.
The hot water would leach the tannins out of the wood fibers, dripping down to the bottom of the vat as this dark, chemical-rich liquid.
But they couldn't ship that liquid because it was mostly water weight. So the final step was to pump that liquid into enormous, steam-heated vacuum pans,
They would boil the liquid continuously until almost all the water evaporated.
leaving behind a highly concentrated, incredibly dense, sticky sludge with the exact consistency and color of thick molasses.
They would pour this warm, steaming sludge into heavy wooden barrels, seal them up, and then face their final, most terrifying challenge.
Getting into the boats.
Yes, they had to get hundreds of these incredibly heavy barrels from the factory in Bryceland over a massive, jagged mountain range down to the boats waiting at Shelter Cove.
This required wagons.
Yeah.
Massive, heavy-duty freight wagons pulled by teams of massive draft horses.
But the dirt wagon roads carved into these mountains were unimaginably steep, and this introduces a terrifying physics problem.
Momentum.
Right. When a fully loaded freight wagon weighing several tons begins descending a 15 or 20% dirt grade, gravity takes over. The standard wooden brake pads on the wagon wheels were completely useless against that kind of momentum.
If the wagon gains too much speed, it literally runs over the team of horses pulling it from behind.
It would be a catastrophic, fatal pileup of wood, barrels, and animals. The teamsters driving these wagons had to find a way to create massive drag.
And their solution is something I still cannot quite wrap my head around.
It is so crazy. When they reached the top of a steep downhill grade, they would stop the wagon, the teamster would get out, chop down a full-size 60-foot tree, and use heavy iron chains to attach the entire downed tree to the back axle of the wagon.
It is the absolute epitome of brute force pioneer engineering. The friction of the massive tree branches and trunk dragging through the dirt and rocks provided exactly enough resistance to act as an anchor.
Keeping the wagon's downward speed manageable so the horses wouldn't be crushed.
I just try to imagine the sensory experience of this. You are a teamster sitting on this wooden bench. Behind you are tons of valuable, sloshing chemical sludge.
The horses are straining.
And dragging directly behind your wagon, tearing up the dirt, throwing dust hundreds of feet into the air, and making a deafening, grinding roar is an entire redwood or fir tree.
It is the 19th century equivalent of deploying a parachute out the back of your car because your brakes went out on a mountain pass. It is absolute madness.
It was madness, but it was highly effective madness. Every day, dozens of wagons, dragging entire trees behind them, churning the mountain roads into deep ruts of dust and mud, brought thousands of barrels of extract down to that 960-foot pier.
But as with almost all extraction industries of that era, there was a fatal inherent flaw built into the business model.
It was completely unsustainable. They were literally clear-cutting their own supply chain.
They didn't replant tan oaks, they just moved deeper into the forest.
By 1920, the Wagner Leather Company realized they had completely exhausted the supply of tan oak trees anywhere near the existing roads. They had stripped the mountains bare.
The factory was still perfectly functional, but the raw material was too far away to retrieve profitably.
They petitioned the county government to build a new road up Redwood Creek, pushing deeper into fresh, untouched forests.
But the county looked at the terrain and the cost, and flatly refused. It was just too expensive.
And just like that, the entire economic engine of the region stalled. Because they ran out of trees, the Pacific Oak Extract Works shut down.
The massive plant in Bryceland was dismantled. The boomtown busted.
Which triggers a massive domino effect for Shelter Cove. This is where the story pivots from human triumph back to nature's ultimate victory.
Once the tan bark industry died, the financial anchor of Shelter Cove vanished entirely. There were no longer millions of dollars flowing through the port to justify maintaining that massive, incredibly expensive 960-foot pier.
The Robar brothers' dream was suddenly economically obsolete.
And this is the crucial lesson of the Lost Coast. The moment humans stopped actively fighting the ocean, the moment they stopped replacing pilings and repairing the decking, the Pacific Ocean immediately began reclaiming its territory.
Nature doesn't negotiate, it just erodes.
The destruction of that pier is such a powerful image. Without constant maintenance, the winter storms just battered it to pieces.
The sources note that by 1937, just a couple of decades after the boom, the entire 960-foot structure was cut apart by the waves.
Think about that. Millions of dollars of labor, engineering, and hubris. And the ocean just tore it down.
Those massive eucalyptus and fir pilings eventually washed up on the black sand beach, smoothed over and looking like nothing more than regular driftwood. The ocean completely erased decades of human dominance.
It is a profound philosophical realization about the undefeated streak of the Pacific. But mankind wasn't quite done trying to conquer the Cove.
No, the allure of the geography was still tempting. Fast forward to 1954, and there was a massive, highly capitalized logging operation that decided they could outsmart the ocean where the pioneers had failed.
Their plan was incredibly ambitious. They didn't want to build a pier. Instead, they hauled 2 million board feet of freshly cut timber down to the beach flat at the Cove.
The strategy was to bind these logs together into massive floating rafts, drag them into the surf, and use tugboats to tow these gigantic wood islands all the way up the coast to the massive lumber mills in Eureka.
They completely underestimated the sheer kinetic violence of the water, specifically around a geographic choke point just north of the Cove called Punta Gorda.
Punta Gorda is notorious among mariners as one of the roughest, most unpredictable stretches of water on the entire Pacific coast.
When the tugboats attempted to haul these massive, unwieldy log rafts around that point, the heavy ocean swells simply lifted them up and tore the steel bindings apart.